Thank you. Thank you, David. I have David to blame for the salacious title, since...
It's all my fault.
Great. I'm going to partly read and partly talk, but what I'd especially like to do is violate the normal format of a lecture by going for a while, then having a few intermediate questions. That means my talking will do that 3 times for 3 different thought experiments, and that means my talking will go a little over the end of the hour. Okay. You know that thought experiments have a long history in philosophy. There's Zeno's paradox about Achilles and the tortoise, and Berkeley's puzzle about whether the tree falling in the forest makes a noise, or Pascal's wager, or Descartes' evil demon who may be deceiving him about everything, including the fact of his own existence. And there are many others. There are some famous contemporary ones, too. Judith Jarvis Thompson's violinist, remember, who's hooked up to an unconsenting patient for 9 full months. This is to utilize that patient's kidneys. This is the well-known example in the literature on abortion. Or Derek Parfit's people who split in half like amoebas. I think it's probably true to say that in philosophy, I'll ask you for confirmation, thought experiments have something of a bad name. Philosophers' excesses pushed to the limit. But what I want to do here is explore a trio of thought experiments in applied ethics to try to persuade you that they have a real and important use in contemporary bioethics and indeed in policy development generally. Now, there are a lot of kinds of thought experiments, or they're what-if questions. Some are science fiction based. What if Earth were invaded by creatures from Mars? Some are utopian. What if they gave a war and nobody came? It's a nicely dated one. Some involve social or political fantasies. What if all rulers governed only in the public interest? They all involve imagining a different set of conditions and circumstances from the world's actual ones. Some are future-oriented. Some envision an alternative present. Some involve conjectures about the past. What if there never had been a Magna Carta? What if the Aztecs and the Incas had repelled the Spanish invaders? What if Hitler had gotten into architecture school, or Castro had made the Washington senators, right? Often thought experiments involve altered assumptions about facts or principle. Some conceive of human nature as different in one respect or another. What if people were fundamentally trusting and cooperative? Or the laws of nature as different? What if gravity operated during the day, anti-gravity at night? Or of economic and political systems as different? What if capitalism withered away? And so on. So, as I said, I want to explore 3 bioethics thought experiments with you here. They're all different, but they're not like any of the ones I've just mentioned. They don't make assumptions, and it's important to remember these things. They don't make assumptions about how human nature or the laws of physical or biological nature might be different, nor do they make social or political or science fiction assumptions of any sort beyond certain assumptions about technological developments that are foreseeable, or at least partly foreseeable. Nor do they engage in utopian or dystopian thinking, even though I hope to persuade you the future that each one of them foresees will look like a utopia from our present perspective. And it's this fact, which I expect only some of us will see, that raises the philosophically interesting questions about thought experiments in bioethics and other applied ethics fields beyond those raised by the thought experiments themselves. So I'm interested both in what you think about the specific thought experiments and what larger lessons we can derive from that. So here comes number 1. Ready? I have handouts too. As you may remember from the late 1960s and early 1970s, At some point during that time, the then U.S. Surgeon General is alleged to have said that it was time to close the book on infectious disease. He says now, when asked about this, there's no paper trail apparently for this remark other than it's being repeated many times. He says he can't remember whether he ever said it, but it doesn't make any difference. This notion was widespread. Time to close the book on infectious disease. We have just about got this conquered. It's almost taken care of. Since then, of course, there's been the emergence of AIDS, the resurgence of tuberculosis in drug-resistant forms, new awareness of global health issues and infectious diseases that cross borders like dengue, malaria, West Nile, widespread infectious conditions like HPV, as well as the emergence of SARS and the feared emergence of person-to-person avian flu. Right? So that from this lull in the late 60s, early 70s, when we thought with a certain amount of complacency, at least in the developed world, that infectious disease was virtually under control, infectious disease, communicable infectious disease, again, is a matter of real concern. So, indeed, many infectious diseases are now well controlled by vaccines or effective therapies. Measles, varicella, leprosy, syphilis, tetanus, diphtheria. Smallpox is extinct in the wild. Polio is on the verge of eradication. Other infectious diseases, particularly those common in developing countries like tuberculosis, malaria, trachoma, sleeping sickness, schistosomiasis, and common intestinal parasitic diseases such as hookworm. There are effective therapies or methods for control, although not widely implemented, and some are not yet either controlled or lack any currently effective vaccines or therapies: Ebola, Marburg, West Nile, SARS, and the resistant strains of TB, HIV, influenza A, and especially the avian flu variety. So we have a sense then that this is resurgent. It's partly controlled, partly not controlled, and there are vast disparities between the developed and the developing world. Now, each of these thought experiments has a technology that goes with it. So there's a background, that was the background, and the technology. The technology is technically complex and interesting, although it has one set of properties in common. These are the new molecular technologies utilizing a variety of different methods, PCR, proteomics, recombinant antigens, various nanotechnologies. They're grouped in various ways. But what they have in common is speed. They make possible rapid and usually inexpensive diagnosis of some infectious disease in a fraction of earlier testing times. So Oraquick, one of the first out for public use as well as clinical use, identifies HIV-1's status with 99.3 sensitivity and 99.8 specificity in just 20 minutes. That's a reduction from the 2-week test and retest method used earlier, and it has high reliability whether a blood sample or oral fluid swab is used. Similar rapid tests are available or under development for many other infectious diseases, including, for example, malaria, dengue, meningitis, SARS, influenza, and others. The emphasis is on speed. There are some new versions. All of them offer results within much less than an hour, some in as little as 120 seconds. That's 2 minutes. So what we want to explore here is how these rapid tests might change things dramatically. So imagine being able to detect any known diagnosable, communicable infectious disease or the underlying pathogen a person might be harboring. HIV, TB, malaria, polio, cholera, SARS, the full range of sexually transmitted diseases, even, I hate to say this here and now, common colds and flu, right? So here's the thought experiment. Suppose that molecular rapid testing is available for all known communicable infectious diseases, both that involve human-to-human transmission and those that are transmitted via an intermediate vector. Just takes an oral sample, maybe a little pinprick. They're all as good as OraQuick, and in many cases faster. There'll be a few cases missed, but virtually no false positives. And also imagine that testing units are small, portable, cheap enough, don't require refrigeration, storage, running water, electricity, or sterile syringes. That means you can do this anywhere. Anywhere? Well, how about airports? So imagine, as you arrive at the airport, you approach the departures counter. You give them your passport, your ticket, and they give you a Q-tip for a cheek swab, or maybe they take a little sterile automated finger prick. The sample is processed automatically on the spot. Right? The information is relayed to the gate in 20 minutes or less. While you are standing in the baggage inspection line, the personal inspection, your shoes are off, your belt is off, your coat is folded up, right? Your sample is being processed, and if you're clean, that information is relayed at the gate. If you, however, test positive for any of these conditions, you are retested at the gate. If you have 2 tests, you're denied boarding, referred to the airport clinic for immediate treatment if it's available, or to the local hospital if it's a more complicated arrangement. Here's the result, right? People who are clean can board the plane, but if a positive result is confirmed, treatment is provided. The same is true for the crew as well. No one is singled out or profiled for risk. Just as with baggage screening, everybody's tested. Nobody boards the plane with a disease they could transmit to anybody else, at least one that has been identified through this rapid test procedure, not either on the plane or after they get off. Right? That's stage 1 of this thought experiment. The World Health Organization estimates that 2.1 billion passengers take airplane flights every year. Yeah, but of course not everybody flies in planes. That's just a small fraction of the population. So continue this thought experiment. This rapid test equipment, which you can use anywhere and is cheap, yielding results for any known communicable disease in 20 minutes or perhaps 120 seconds, can be used in schools, stadiums, hospitals, churches, movie theaters, shopping centers, even local grocery stores. School, between the time a student enters the vestibule and the time they're allowed to stuff their books in their locker, they're tested. Straight to the infirmary for those who have a communicable disease. Hospitals, nursing homes, between the time you check in at the front desk and the time someone is allowed to visit a friend or make rounds on patients there, everyone is tested, right? Visitors, care workers, and physicians. Riding the train or entering the subway, a brief delay is all that's necessary before people are on their way, and so on. We can imagine this, in effect, this kind of universal screening and testing policy all over the world. No entry into spaces of close human contact without first ensuring that people will not bring their transmissible diseases with them. In lots of places, airports, schools, stadiums, tall buildings, people are already screened for weapons. And in some institutions, prisons and the military, for example, broader testing is already mandatory upon entry. This thought experiment takes the same intuition. It screens people for their potential to cause a specific sort of harm to others, whether they intend to or not. Okay? So that is thought experiment number 1. I just brought a little sheet with this. Maybe you can give those around to Pete. Yeah. Because there are 3 of these, and I thought maybe we could. I see all these horrified looks on your faces, especially as it progresses from the airport stage to beyond that. And so I'm just interested in what you think. I'm instructed to repeat your comments for the tape here. But I know that our photographer does action shots and covers basketball, so he'll be able to focus on you if you make the slightest move. So what do you think? Yeah.
Well, first of all, the criteria that you established for screening is very broad. I just stated.
Let's see if this works. Will this work if I let you talk into there? Good.
Okay, so the criteria for being part of the screen is very broad and doesn't take into account the severity of the illness, the prevalence of the condition in the community, the ease of transmission, et cetera, et cetera. You've included a variety of things.
Everybody.
And second, it's not so hypothetical because it's a similar approach was taken during the SARS epidemic with regard to thermal scanning. And in Singapore, you couldn't get into any public building unless you went through a thermal scanning. You couldn't get into Canada at the major air facilities, especially Vancouver, and they screened several million people, and anyone with any fever was referred for follow-up, and they didn't find a single SARS case. And so the question is that effort worth all the cost to try to save one case? And then it depends, I suppose, and I'll let other people pick up from here, on what condition you're talking about and what the circumstances are.
Yeah. So that's great. Everybody heard this, right? So, of course, the first answer is we're talking about screening for everything that we can, not just identified outbreak, and we're talking about screening everybody. The thermal scanning in that you mentioned is said that they didn't pick up any cases. It is said to have made passengers and the populace feel better that something was being done. But of course, but thermal scanning is not a reliable method of detecting illness compared to the rapid assay methods that we're kind of. So the germ of the idea is there, but we're talking about something far more widespread, far more reliable for disease detection, but much broader in scope. Anybody else have a thought about this?
My only thought is that it doesn't change what's going on in the non-traveling community that much. I mean, if you think about there however many people traveling that you mentioned, and I don't remember the number.
2.1 billion.
Okay.
On planes.
But there are a whole lot more people not traveling.
Right.
And so, with the exception of highly communicable diseases, whether you have a cold or not is probably not going to change
So we
the
talked
prevalence
about,
in the non-traveling
Well, so we talked
population.
about schools, theaters, stadiums, grocery stores, and so on. So you could construct the thought experiment any way you want, but it's constructed here in the most extreme form. Any place of public contact or public congregation, everyone is tested as they enter.
Okay.
Sure, businesses.
Well, what's your goal?
What's the goal? Nice question. Yeah.
Well, I mean, AIDS you're not going to pick up on an airplane. So what are you intending to accomplish?
You might pick up AIDS on an airplane. No, you're not going to contract AIDS on, well, unless you're. We won't discuss. We won't really explore how you might get AIDS on an airplane, but this thought experiment covers both diseases that could be transmitted on the plane, that is, aerosolized diseases primarily, or kind of surface contact diseases. It's not AIDS, or diseases that you could transmit after the plane lands.
So why are we doing it?
Yeah, so why are we doing this? Anybody else want to comment on the thought experiment?
And this is one of those things that we can work easily into the thought experiment if we want to. But there was a difference between what you said about, so if you do come up with that double positive, you're taken to the hospital, clinic, or whatever. And what you said about how they were referred for treatment. And that just struck me as a really big difference in that, okay, if we are setting something like this up, are we also then imagining that we have the infrastructure to treat everyone that is identified in this way? And that's going to get back to that, what's the goal? Because if you leave out that piece of what do we do when we find it?
Nice point.
Right.
Well, and all of these are things that would require multiple treatments, extended treatment, or most of them anyway. TB.
Syphilis is easy, right? Bend over, get one shot in the butt of penicillin, that's it?
That's
right?
So I hear. But
is that right? Yeah?
Also not likely to be contracted on an airplane.
No, but after the plane lands, right?
so it just builds on what Andrea's point about, how do you handle lengthy treatment?
Right. So a beautiful question, right? Some diseases are easy to treat immediately on the spot. Treatment's effective and generally without side effects. Not always, but right. Other diseases, especially chronic conditions.
Well, we've had all these billions of travelers every year. What evidence do we have that there is transmission that is of significance?
Oh, well, we have lots. We know that SARS came to Toronto via I believe she was 62 years old, a grandmother, single passenger flight from Hong Kong to Toronto. Caused 44 deaths in Toronto. So that's one example. There are many other examples of disease transmitted. But remember, we're talking, in the broadest form of this thought experiment, we're talking about more than just intercontinental plane transmission, although that has been a major worry for people interested in disease spread.
From the individual's point of view, somebody with a disease such as HIV would then be permanently shunned in society. They would fail all the time because it cannot be treated.
Nice question. So you can imagine adaptations for this. So somebody who had a low virus titer, right, had a low viral load,
Maintenance.
Right. So we can imagine amendments of this thought experiment and more sophisticated technology that can distinguish between people who are actually contagious, people who have a chronic condition which is not contagious or not very contagious. Latent syphilis might be an example, or some forms of tuberculosis. We can imagine people carrying a little card saying, yes, I have HIV, but I have, been counseled in this way. I always use these protectives, something like that. But so we can imagine, because this objection about chronic communicable disease is real. And, of course, some diseases we have no treatment for at all, right?
But except in scope and maybe the context of travel, you're not raising anything new. I mean, New York City in the 50s required chest x-rays routinely for students to enter schools because of the fear of TB. Syphilis testing was required for marriage licenses in many states. The SARS, as Mark indicates, was required in various countries. Sex workers in countries require testing for sexually transmissible diseases. The only thing you're raising is, what about it affecting all of us?
Yes. That's it.
And yeah.
Yeah. That's great. And we'll make this one last because we have more.
I think I was going to the affecting all of us side too. Given the prevalence of disease, the emergence of new diseases, and we can diagnose them before we can treat them, how long before everybody or virtually everybody, has a disqualifying condition that doesn't allow them to participate in society. So what happens then? You develop an alternate. Now we have an airline that's only for people that are positive for this disease. The pilots are all positive, the people are all positive. How about everybody live in a giant leper colony? That's where this is heading, because more and more people will have something that's not treatable, that's transmissible. Eventually you'll have a second society that's just for the tainted or the lepers.
Great. So you can see a lot of problems with this thought experiment. So you can see problems with this thought experiment, and I will return to that, and especially to your question about what's the point. Okay. So now there's another thought experiment I'd like to try on you. This is a little, requires a bigger leap in a way. The background conditions to which it's addressed, the first one was addressed to the incidence, seeming resurgence of infectious disease, though of course it's never been already gone. This thought experiment concerns large-scale reproductive problems, in particular global population growth and decline, teen pregnancy, abortion, pregnancy following rape and mass rape. Mass rape is a frequent guerrilla and civil unrest tactic occurring in many parts of the world. That's the background. We all know about those immense social problems all over the globe. But the technology is very simple, and we already have it in hand. It requires a little bit of discussion of contraceptive technologies, so pardon me for a detour into these sensitive areas. But we want to remember what's important to understand is how this technological development works. So as things now occur, to get right down to the facts of life as directly as possible, unless something is done to prevent it, about 1 in 5 occasions of sexual intercourse between a fertile human male and a fertile human female during the female's fertile period results in pregnancy. In this sense, we can say pregnancy is the normal or default outcome of human sexual intercourse. It's what's likely to happen if you do nothing to intervene. This is nature's arrangement, the way human biology is developed, as in other species, for ensuring adequate fertility for population survival and growth. Now, there are a lot of ways. I assume this is not news to anybody in this room. So pregnancy may be the default outcome of sexual intercourse, but there are many ways of preventing it. There's total abstinence, of course. But if you were sexually active or might become so, the best way to see what's at stake is to consider how this prospect might look to you if you were choosing a contraceptive method for yourself. If you were a woman in a historical, pre-scientific society, the pregnancy prevention methods available to you, most likely from an older woman in the privacy of the women's hut, would have included an enormous variety of plugs, barriers, timing devices, potions made from roots, barks, herbs, even arsenic and spider eggs, many with disastrous side effects. There'd be amulets, spells, and prayers, as well as an array of after-the-fact methods of trying to discontinue pregnancy, including many sorts of potions used as abortifacients and more brutal methods like being struck in the abdomen. Of course, if you were a woman making the same choice today, your options would be much safer. They'd include a range of traditional and modern technologies, including douches, foams, films, gels, sponges, pills, diaphragms, cervical caps, vaginal rings, intrauterine devices, implants, injectables, transdermal patches, vaccines, timing schedules, including lactational amenorrhea and natural family planning, surgical sterilization by means of tubal ligation or other methods, and many others. You'd also have morning after pills and abortifacients you could use up to 90 days, and surgical abortion available as well. And you'd have a great deal more information about the range of contraceptive strategies among which you were choosing. However, things would be different and much sparser if you were a man. If you were a man in any pre-scientific historical society, your only means of controlling your fertility would be various forms of abstinence and withdrawal or coitus interruptus. There weren't any real contraceptive technologies available to you until the invention of the sheepskin condom only a few centuries ago. And if you were a man in the contemporary world, you'd be limited to just 3 basic ways of avoiding contributing to pregnancy. For one, coitus interruptus and related withdrawal or withholding practices, including abstinence-based natural family planning. For another, the condom. And the third, vasectomy or other surgical sterilization. That's all there is, guys. There are some new longer-term male contraceptives under active development, but at the moment there would only be those 3 for you. Now, so this thought experiment concerns one subdivision of this huge array of contraceptive technologies. And we want to focus on those that there are 5 characteristics they can vary in, whether they are short-acting or long-acting, that is, effective for just a single occasion of intercourse or just a few versus long-term. They can be user-controlled or user-independent, depending on who makes it work. They can be coitus-related or coitus-independent, that is, effective only if used at the time of sexual intercourse or effective if used at any time. They can be sex-interfering or non-sex interfering, and they can be reversible or non-reversible. So we divide off all the ones that are not long-acting, user-independent. The ones we're keeping are the ones that are long-acting, user-independent, coitus-independent, non-sex interfering, and reversible. So it distinguishes essentially contraceptive methods that are time of need, you can call them. You use them when you need protection to prevent pregnancy. The hybrid forms like the pill or the depot injectable. The single-effect contraceptives and contraceptives like morning-after pills and sterilization methods, put all that to the side. Those are the ones that you need to do something to make them work, versus what I like to call the automatics, the ones that take care of contraception for you without your having to do anything about it at all. There are only 2 of these at the moment. There's the intrauterine device and the subdermal hormone-releasing implant, and some various mixed forms of those. They're very long-acting. The subdermal implant was originally licensed for 5 years, probably effective for longer, 10 for the intrauterine device. They require no user cooperation and so on, and both of those types can be reversed right away. So the effect of this thought experiment, the effect of these true automatics is, in effect, to reverse the default mode in human reproduction, resetting human biology not to result in pregnancy unless steps are taken to allow it to occur. They do this in a specific way. They insert an extra level of choice making. Right? You can always open yourself to the possibility of pregnancy, but unless you do that, it doesn't occur. So here's the thought experiment. You ready? I bet you can tell what it is. What if everybody, that is, all fertile women, and then, assuming there's a similar technology, there are technologies now under hot development for males, all fertile males, all fertile women and all fertile males, routinely used automatic reversible contraception all the time, except when they wanted to have a child. What would be the effect? Well, as things now stand in the U.S., about half of all pregnancies are unintended. About half of those are carried to term. The other half carried or miscarried or aborted. There are about 750,000 cases of teen pregnancy in the U.S. Every year, about 90% of it unintended. Those wouldn't happen. In the U.S., we all know all the facts about abortion frequency. In the U.S. and other countries with similar demographic patterns in reproduction, somewhere between a half and a quarter of the pregnancies now occurring, that is between the rate of unintended and aborted, would not occur if the default method were reduced. Population growth would also slow. Evidence from high fertility societies shows that women would choose to have fewer children than they accept having if pregnancy occur, typically about 2 children fewer in most surveys. Rape and pregnancy following rape and mass rape wouldn't occur, and so on. Now, a first concern will be reproductive rights. What about reproductive rights? Remember that the thought experiment is, what if everybody did this? I think we can argue that it would actually, enhancing the default mode, would actually enhance reproductive rights. All right? This may seem paradoxical, but if you can only become pregnant when you've made a positive choice to do so, there will be many reasons for which pregnancy can't occur. It doesn't occur because you forgot your contraceptive, misused it, you forgot to go to the drugstore, the village elder took it away from you, you having a candlelight dinner and overcome by passion, nothing was further from your mind. All of those things can't occur. It requires an active, positive choice for pregnancy to occur. And, of course, for the male, that already produces a gain in reproductive freedom if he can't sire a pregnancy he didn't intend to through any of the mishaps that I just mentioned. And if it takes 2 to tango, right, as in this thought experiment, conception would be possible only with the explicit voluntary election of both parties. That's the thought experiment. So what do you think?
Where do I sign up?
Yeah?
Repeat the question.
That question, where do I sign up? Right, this is not a question, this is a plea, right? Yeah?
You're going to have a lot more disease at the airport.
A lot more disease at the airport. Yeah.
Actually, that was
A serious thought.
that was the first one that came to me, of course. It's the word I signed up with. Seriously, I have noticed one thing in common for both of these thought experiments so far. They both reveal interesting fears, as in the instinctive squirming reaction to this is we'd kill ourselves off, right? Nobody would ever choose to have babies, but that's not really the case. That's not really the truth, right? It's that I think really more of what we're afraid of is what would happen if both partners really had that active consenting choice and you had to negotiate that. That's really where I think the squirmy fear is coming from. Having to look at that straight on in the face.
What if I want it and he doesn't?
Yes.
Or he wants it
And I don't. And how would our society react to that leveling of power?
Great point. Anybody else? What do you think?
He was so tempted.
He was tempted, right?
I only deal with thermal scanners.
Well, I have 2 things. One is I don't think it would affect rapes at all. I think, in fact, it may increase that.
It might not affect the rape. It but
outcome of
the outcome of the rape.
And I think one's probably worse or as bad as the other one. And then the second thing is that for those people who are incarcerated or who the judge has taken away their rights to have children because they burnt 3 of them or something like that, then they don't have that control anymore. So the judge or whoever, society, would still need to have some.
So we're worried about societal controls and whether they are ever appropriate. Do I have any takers up here? You let all the women comment on this, and there are no guys with input? It's perfectly all right?
I bet it's usually that way.
It's what?
Probably it's usually that way.
It's usually that way on this topic.
On this topic.
Well,
rarely you'll see some, maybe the ones that have difficulty with.
And this is itself symptomatic because we traditionally think of contraception as a women's issue, right? And the poor hapless guys are out there with not much say. The power structure in pregnancy resides with the woman in the sense that she's the one with reliable forms of contraception at least available to her for reasons we know.
Very simply, yes, it's perfectly all right. That would in fact be an improvement over the situation as it stands. And I don't, barring of course the obvious side effects that would of course be coming from it, but if we can pretend those don't exist, I don't see how there'd be anything bad about it.
I mean, I do think this would be a great idea, but the going along the thought line that was started earlier, societal controls, if this is done worldwide, what's going to happen in a nation where there might be, societal constraints on people from reproducing? I mean, if this is implemented in everybody and it requires some sort of medical procedure to remove, then it would be altogether possible for an autocratic nation to completely prevent certain undesirables from having children.
Nice point. Let's do.
It seems to me that there was a presumption that both sexes would do this equally, and that both had equal power to make those choices in a society in which there is either primarily male domination. How much is the power that a male would dictate to a female? You may not use contraception. Your
or
presumption,
you have it reversed right
exactly.
Now. Right.
So your presumption is that there's equal power in both genders, but that may or may not be true.
Yeah, nice point. Yeah.
Well, and building off that, an assumption of a neutral or a neutral medical system, a medical system that in which power doesn't flow and operate in ways that would either force people or have specific effects on everyone being.
Nice point. Okay, so.
Well, it just shows that we need a little bit more in the example, because there have been 4 or 5 different interpretations of what this actually involves. Is this individuals with free access to this? Is this somehow the society controlling it? So we don't actually have a complete thought experiment yet. So no wonder you're getting a wide variety of answers. We're answering different questions.
Nice point. Okay, so that was number 2. These are just so you can keep track of it. Well, it's nice to know where we've been, because our real agenda here is to think about the effective thought experiments generally. So we're just warming up to this. Here's number 3. Ready? This one is the one about race. We already dye our hair different colors, and we change the color of our eyes with contact lenses. But imagine something new, a temporary, reversible skin dye that changes the color of one's skin, the whole skin, all at once, in one easy dip. Perhaps it's some sort of vegetable dye, perhaps it's a new chemical process, but whatever it is, it's temporary, harmless, and wears off in a week or so. You just need to dip into a bath of it for a few minutes, perhaps at your beauty parlor, or your health club, or maybe in your own bathtub, or Maybe swallow some pigment-changing pills, or maybe there's some sort of radiant pigmentation alteration process that can be done with special lights in a converted tanning bed. Whatever it is, you can be white this week, Native American next week, Asiatic the week after that, then darkest African, and then back to white. You can start out black, turn the olive color of Mediterranean peoples, be white for a while, then go back to black. These dyes come in various shades, perhaps with suggestive designer names. Pocahontas, Genghis Khan, Louis Armstrong, Shirley Temple, and so on. Skin color can be changed at will. Of course, we can't yet exactly see how this might work. We shouldn't get stuck on the technical challenges of skin color change and whether, for instance, it would be easier to go from light to dark or tones or the other way around, or whether there might involve topical irritation or systemic side effects. And race color wouldn't, of course, wouldn't alter other race-linked morphological traits like eyelid shape, lip contours, or structure of the nose. Nor would it alter other race-associated physiological and psychosocial traits like postural patterns exhibited in newborns, or like the tendency of Zinacatan women in southern Mexico, or descendants of the Maya population, to keep their arms close to their sides, or patterns of, racially coded speech, dress, and so on. But just for altering skin color, imagine that it works easily, quickly, effectively, without inconvenience, side effects, or cost. Just one easy dip will do it. And it's, as I said, temporary, harmless, and wears off in a week. Now, there are many accounts of attempts at skin color change. I'll just mention John Howard Griffin in Black Like Me, Grace Halsell, who did the same thing, changing from white to black in the South. Phillips Roth's The Human Stain, Pudd'nhead Wilson, Nella Larson's Passing. All of these explore race issues, but these generally explore taking advantage of ambiguous coloration to cast oneself as a member of one racial group rather than another, or exploring specific social issues. We're thinking about something much more radical, the possibility of thoroughgoing skin color change in any direction, to or from any hue, at any time. Now, is there something, this is about the moral issues in skin color change, is there something troubling about this? We're already familiar with some attempts at modification, skin lighteners and tanning parlors, but consider these cases. A student changes color to avoid a bad grade from a racist professor. A community resident changes color to socialize better and get into the golf club. A worker seeking union membership changes color to appear more acceptable to the ethnic group that controls the union. Teachers, doctors, and tourists working in or traveling to distant continents change color to match those they're among. An artist or an aesthete experiments with altering personal appearance to challenge conventional norms of beauty. A person committed to a deeper, more reflective self-understanding changes color, perhaps again and again, to explore just who he or she is in the world. So there are some examples. We can tease out, I think, flagrant examples of deceptive race-colored deception. Say a person interviewing for a position reserved under an affirmative action program or a scholarship designation for people of a specific minority group, or the person who, the bank robber photographed on camera who changes color to elude the police and so on. We can tease those out. And we can also imagine clearly sympathetic race color alterations when a person changes color even ever so slightly, say Tutsi to Hutu, despite the fact that those are very close, or Eastern European Semitic to Northern European Aryan to avoid racial slaughter. Those cases at both ends aren't the problematic ones. It's the intermediate cases that raise the ethically interesting issues. And the question is whether there's some other form of deception also at work and whether it's ethically permissible. So consider these possibilities. These are little sub-nested further thought experiments, right, in our larger third one here. You have a blind date with a young woman who, you are told, is Asiatic. It's a blind date. You haven't seen her yet. You decide to be Asiatic color on the first date, but if all goes well, you plan to be African color next week for the second date to see if she still likes you under other circumstances. You'll be Latin American hued when you take her out to dance the salsa, but palest Northern European Caucasian much later on, if all goes well, when you go to meet her parents, your prospective in-laws. You're a writer working on a massive multi-generational novel about the South during the time of the Civil War and following. When you're writing about white characters, you make yourself white. When you're writing about black characters, you make yourself black. When you're writing about the mulatto offspring that arise from intrigues and relationships between whites and blacks, you make yourself a variety of in-between shades to match the characters you are creating in your mind. You're a delegate to an international non-governmental organization concerned with employment conditions in the developing world. You adopt a kind of compromised skin tone, not too light, not too dark, not really clearly identifiable as of any particular national origin. Critics say you're pandering, but you say you want to communicate that you have the interests of all the world's peoples in mind. So the question here that these little nested thought experiments raise is whether a person is somehow really a specific color, and if so, whether it's somehow dishonest to change it. This might be called the issue of race integrity. Is there, or should there be, is presumed to be such a thing as race integrity? Would it be wrong to violate it? And if so, exactly what would the violation consist in? It's not just the issue of what racial color a person was born or what the relationship is between a person and his or her genetic parents, but whether race identity is somehow normatively required, somehow basic. Is it, for example, a central principle in the maintenance of social solidarity among human groups, and hence desirable? Or is it a fraudulent pseudo-scientific fiction invented in the 19th century, the pretext for friction and abuse? It's important to note that this question arises even if one's ontological account of race involves racial skepticism, the view that races do not really exist, or any of the various forms of racial constructionism, views that hold in various ways that race identity is socially ascribed and acknowledged within a social system, or population naturalism, the view that race is a biological product of partial reproductive isolation, resulting in different frequencies in human population groups of a variety of heritable traits, of which skin color is only one. The claim our thought experiment challenges on all versions of race ontology is this: whether specific racial origins and racial groupings, real or constructed, entail that there is some specific body color this person really is, whatever his or her temporary surface appearance may be. We've seen some examples of body color integrity assumption at work in the past with respect to hair color. So this group looks as though some of you can remember the hair color ads of the 1950s and 60s, the Clairol ads. You see a woman and her child, and they have the same hair color. The legend is only her hairdresser knows for sure. Now, we don't hold this as if there was something, unseemly about knowing that she'd dyed her hair. We don't make that assumption anymore. Women and men routinely dye their hair without embarrassment or pretense, including unnatural colors like blue and purple that could hardly be mistaken for the real thing. So what if skin color were like hair color, a component of physical appearance that could be routinely changed at will, that could be used tactically or recreationally or in exploratory self-discovery, and were furthermore cheap, easily available, and presented no technical, medical, or economic obstacles.
I think we don't know enough about how personal identity is connected with skin color. I mean, in all the ways you mentioned. So, it might be a little scary if you were dating and every time the person showed up with a different skin color, just like if every time the person showed up with a different face. It would look a little odd.
Really interesting point. It might be, since we have no experience with it, previous two thought experiments are ones that we have some experience. You were pointing out the kinds of surveillance we already do with infectious disease, and we already know a good deal about contraception, but this one we have no experience with. So the question is, what do we learn about our reactions?
Well, I think we already have a certain amount of this going on. Consider plastic surgeon. And we went to China years ago, and my husband's a plastic surgeon, and we were asked, or he was asked particularly about changing the eyelids because they wanted Western eyes. We have people who pass for whatever they choose to pass. So if they have parents that are different nationalities, they might choose one over the other. Mm-hmm. We have tanning salons, tanning beds. Mm-hmm. This is just, I think it would be nice in one sense because it might break down some of the stereotypes we have.
Well, I want to go ahead and build on, we're already doing this. You mentioned hair color change, but I can put my nose ring on when I want to hang out with the guys, and I can take my nose ring out when I go and meet the girlfriend's parents. And you kept giving these examples of people conveniently changing their skin color when it serves them. We change the way we dress. We change the way we talk. We change all kinds of things because we alter our identity to the circumstances. In a society where there's a lot of intermarriage, everybody is some portion of every race anyway, and what your race is becomes what you self-reported. Do I choose to call myself Latino? Do I choose to call myself African American? I have a little of both. There's some white in there too. It becomes self-reported, and I think skin color is absolutely immaterial in this. I think it's about identity.
Whoops, better come a little closer. I was sitting here wondering if maybe the opposite might possibly be true, that what this could do, unlike the other examples, would be to increase the awareness of race and color, and perhaps increase the stereotyping and the shunning of a race, or the negative perceptions of any given race, rather than encouraging finding value in every race and promoting understanding.
Well, my question would be, how would this change the meanings that, at least in America, we have assigned to specific skin colors. In other places around the world, different meanings are assigned to different skin colors. But, like the Tutsi and Hutu, would it be, the meaning is not so much about skin color, or the tension is not about skin color, but it's instead about the history that you have told about yourself, where you come from, whether you're farmers or cattle men. So would this lead to coming up with different things to categorize each other around?
I'm trying to put my thought together. I think if this were what was happening, would we find that in various areas of cities, countries, whatever, there would be everyone kind of going the same way? Or would we find people going opposite ways?
So when we're in Beijing, everybody is Asian colored.
Yeah.
When we're in India, everybody is India, sort of medium brown.
This society,
right? Everybody's
wants to be part of that society, so they're the same.
Great. So now, those are three thought experiments, and they all have multiple parts. And So the question is what thought experiments like these can show us. And remember that they are all ones that don't make counterfactual assumptions other than technological developments, and they don't change the laws of human nature, all that stuff that we were talking about. So in the interest of time, I will skip a little bit here, but point out to you that at least from what we've heard here and what I also hear elsewhere and you see in the literature for partial versions of these thought experiments, is that with respect to number one, the one about surveillance and treatment for infectious disease, the objections concern primarily concerns about constraints and limitations of liberty. Would people with chronic diseases be detained for a long time? What if you're fetched out of line, your partner boards, but you can't? What's the message there? And so on, right? But there are many, and there are also questions about practicability. What if your luggage has already been sent on, but you don't get on? And a little stuff like that. Would the cost be too high? What about the magnitude of inconvenience and the huge violation of liberty? And of course, there are many ways that we can try to modify the thought experiment, but those are typically those are the ones that come to mind. With respect to number two, I think there are both objections of the same sort, but many of the objections that I hear to this one involve the question of how we get there from here. What would make it be the case that everyone, every fertile female and every fertile male, would routinely use automatic contraception? This one seems then to raise the specter of coercion as well. What about nuns? What about celibates? What about, people who just aren't interested in sex? What about 12-year-olds and so on? So this one seems to raise another set of issues, and largely about coercion. I think, though, in this experiment, we are invited to notice some assumptions that we make in thinking about sex and reproduction that are underlying, particularly that there's no real difference in forms of contraception, that there is, that contraception is only for the sexually active, an assumption we make all the time, and that one's enough when it comes to contraception. Those are all assumptions that are commonplace. When we think about number three, right, I think this group has actually hit on the issues that are, to me, seem to be most central in this one. Whether you could if you can unmoor skin color from the concept of race, whether that would lead to the dissolution of racism altogether, or whether it would devolve into more careful inspection of eyelid shape, lip shape, nose shape, hair texture, bodily structure, in order to divine the real truth, so to speak, about a person's race. Would our interest in race leave only a sort of welter of generalizations about morphological traits like femur length or orbit structure or pelvis shape, or whether the lingual surfaces of the incisors are spatulate as they are in whites and blacks, or shovel-shaped as they are in Asians, that may identify ancestral origins but are lost within the much greater range of biologic and genetic variability within each group. So the question is, in this era, which we like to think of as, and is sometimes called, post-racist, or an era of growing racial intolerance, whether this thought experiment, the possibility of routine, transitory but total race color change, whether it would reinforce or reduce the racism we know in this society. Okay? Now, so we come to the thing that seems to me to be most central about these thought experiments. And that is, pardon my nose here, what kinds of objections do they elicit? These are all different from objections to traditional thought experiments like Zeno's paradox or Descartes' evil demons and Judith Jarvis Thompson's violinist. That what happens is that we tend to look at the practical as well as ethical objections to the implementation of the thought experiment and are much less likely to look at the outcome scenario. That's the point of the question of the person we look. These three thought experiments all project comparative utopias, at least compared to our current social situation, an almost complete end to communicable disease. That is, if you identify and treat all diseases for which treatment is available, those diseases are gradually eliminated, or if they have human vectors only, eradicated and gone or under control forever. So the total disease burden of communicable infectious disease is brought way down. What about the second one? We can imagine a situation in which the occurrence of unwanted or unintended pregnancy is reduced to virtually zero. Right? But that isn't what we think about. We think about how to get there. Right? What about the racism one? Right? We can at least imagine, though because this thought experiment is less familiar to us, the prediction is less, an era in which, because race color, skin color, the typically most frequent identifier for race identification is now no longer, so to speak, reliable, the notion of race simply melts away. It's not that you don't see that people have different visual appearances, but the notion of race that has been reinforced by those different appearances is just gone. Right? Those are the outcome states that we imagine in thought experiments. At least that's what I think we should be working to imagine. Now here's the problem. If these outcome states are what such thought experiments foresee, isn't that a reason for exploring the objections and the associated assumptions backwards, so to speak, rather than forwards? First a reason for first assuming that the end goal the thought experiment discloses is the comparatively utopian situation it imagines, and then as an afterthought figuring out how to get there from here. Aren't these thought experiments really proposals in disguise? So the real thought experiment, this is a sort of meta-level thought experiment, is about whether we are or are not actually able to imagine the future scenario that the thought experiment projects. That is, so to speak, whether we are really capable of performing the thought experiment at all, rather than just talking about it. And if we can perform it, then we reason backwards from its new vantage point, looking to our current situation. It's not an easy achievement, and many observers cannot or will not do it at all. Thomas Kuhn thinks of thought experiments, at least in the sciences, as able to precipitate paradigm shift. There's something analogous here in normative areas too, but which may not happen just on its own. We have to work to precipitate paradigm shift by means of them. Let me skip. With any one of these thought experiments, the effort is to imagine the outcome state and then reason backwards. Here's a way of seeing how hard this is to do, and I'm getting close to the end. Imagine some examples of what might have been earlier thought experiments for seeing the future worlds dramatically enhanced by the development of some technology. These have the same form as our current thought experiments, and how difficult it might have been to project such a world and then look backwards for the problems. Consider 5 historical figures, how they might have projected what the future would be like if the use of specific technological developments with which they were associated were to become widespread. That's what we've been doing in every case. Imagine Benjamin Franklin in 1752 as he experimented with a kite and a key in a lightning storm, foreseeing a world in which electricity was so cheap, so safe, so usable for so many different applications that most people use it routinely in their homes, and nearly everybody in the world is affected and aided by it. Imagine Edward Jenner in 1796 vaccinating a small boy with cowpox, seeing into a future in which smallpox, which in his day killed and disfigured and blinded millions of people a year, would finally be completely eradicated from the earth. Or imagine Henry Ford in 1903 as he founded his motor company, imagining what the United States or the world would be like if nearly everybody had an automobile. Or imagine Marie Curie, either in 1903 as she and her husband Pierre received the Nobel Prize for Physics, or in 1911 as she received the Nobel Prize for Chemistry, conjecturing about a world in which radium and other radioactive substances were used in a huge range of applications, from cancer therapy to detonation reactions. 10 minutes, it says. And I realize I forgot to give you the third of these if you want to take them home. So that's 4 of the 5. Let's just be content with that. We don't know whether these historical individuals actually made such thought experiments. Jenner certainly did. But we see what they could have done because we live in those worlds now, right? We've already undergone the analogous paradigm shifts in our conception of what is possible in the world and how we relate to each other. Right? They might not have anticipated some details. Like the long-haul trailer truck or the Maserati. Henry Ford wouldn't be anticipating those, even if he could see a whole world populated by Model A's. Jenner did foresee it. The only thing he wouldn't have foreseen was that 200 years later, exactly, the only remaining smallpox virus would be fully under human control, sealed in canisters in high-security laboratories, and completely eliminated from the natural world. Now, for each of these, there would have been objections. You know, if everybody had a car, where would there be room to drive them? Where would we get enough gasoline? Wouldn't they collide with each other? Jenner's was often hit with objections. There'd be too many side effects. It would cost too much. That would be playing God. But here, I'm sorry, I'm just skipping. The analogy with Jenner's thought experiment, which he actually did make, might seem to end. Jenner might have foreseen a world completely rid of smallpox, the world that until recently has seemed to be our own. We now know, of course, that it's not just 2 canisters of smallpox virus, 1 in Russia and 1 here, but that many countries apparently have smallpox virus stored clandestinely, that others try to buy or steal the virus. Nobody knows where it all is or who will do it. So the analogy between misuses of smallpox in biological warfare and the 3 thought experiments concerns the many possibility of abuse. Would achieving control over infectious disease leave whole populations at greater risk for bioterrorist use? Would the imposition of automatic contraception be targeted against individuals or groups in socially or racially biased ways? Would the possibility of skin color change redirect attention to other divisive characteristics? But these possibilities can't be ignored, but they can be explored only, and here's the bottom line point, after we are actually able to imagine the outcome scenario foreseen, and it's only then that we can really consider the moral conditions that must be met for these future states to be acceptable. For instance, that surveillance for infectious disease is always accompanied by prompt and effective treatment, or that programs utilizing automatic contraceptive guarantee no targeting of just high-risk individuals, and they also guarantee immediately reversible, or that race, color, change technology, whatever it is, be available to everyone, not just the rich. The one thing we can't do is reject these thought experiments, and that's because we're not, with any of them, starting at zero. We're halfway there with respect to control of infectious disease, at least in the developed world. Family planning programs and contraceptive programs are available to many of the large proportion of women in the world, although here I worry that we're going backwards. The original long-term Norplant, the subdermal implant, approved for 5 years, it's been re-released in versions last only 2 years or 1 year. And there's much more emphasis on morning after and emergency contraception. And as we said about our enthusiasm for believing that racism is nearly behind us, it's hard to see whether we're moving away from that or other dismaying forms might raise their heads. Just the same, we can see these three comparative utopian experiments. And it's there, I think, that the greater normative push occurs. I think we have to, when we deal with thought experiments, train ourselves, force ourselves not to leap to the objections too quickly, but to see, feel, understand the outcome state, right? And then work backwards. Right? We can see in a way why we should hurry to get there, but also the risks and problems we might have along the way. So thank you for entertaining these thought experiments with me, and I'm happy to have your input into all of them. Thank you.
We have a couple of moments for questions.
There were so many questions before. Yeah.
Well, I found it interesting that you started off by saying these are utopian, relative utopian outcomes, and then let's work backwards to how we got there, because I didn't see them that way personally. Maybe I'm a paranoid. But I thought you described three dystopias. And also the central conceit that some sort of technology will enable us then to achieve some sort of utopia goes against everything I've seen in the history of mankind and technology. So your Ben Franklin says, wow, there'll be electricity will light homes, and I can say now we're dealing with global warming. I mean, there's always another side. And I don't personally believe that technology creates utopias. So as you say, you must accept this initially as a comparative utopia, take the outcome, work backwards. But I had a gut reaction against all three as dystopias as soon as you brought them out.
Really interesting.
It's kind of interesting in a way. And yes, you were absolutely right with what you said to me before the lecture started. My background is in process improvement, and so all of these thought experiments are looking at that future outcome. What could it be, this end state? When you're solving a process problem, you figure out, okay, what is the problem? What is it about this that really irritates us? What would it look like if it were perfect? What would it look like if it never irritated me ever again? What would I have to do to get there? And so you're talking about looking at these outcome states and looking backwards. In Six Sigma, we call it failure proofing. So if Ben Franklin looked forward and said, everybody has electricity, wow, how am I going to do that? Right now, everybody'd have to walk around with a kite strapped to their butt, and that would suck. I don't want to deal with the kind of electrical burns I got to find another source. Well, if I find another source and it's coal, what is that going to do, right? So in that working backwards you're also fixing things as you go. Then you're only going to get smacked by the stuff that you couldn't predict, the truly unexpectable, unexplainable things. So really, in a way, yeah, you could say, here we go to something that's equally bad, but I'm not there yet. I have time to fix it.
Anybody else?
Well, I think the devil's in the details, and there are too many details here that have been just ignored. I mean, one of the last ones, for example, you thought maybe we're going backwards if that long-term contraception went from 5 years to 3 years. But if you think of it from a woman's point of view, at, say, age 35 years, that seems fine. And then all of a sudden she meets some guy, and she's changed her mind.
Yeah, but
Or
remember,
what if she couldn't get pregnant right away?
but the reversible. Remember, part of the thought experiment is
going 5 years or 2 years.
no, because it requires new installation,
Well,
right?
it requires you to think about whether this is really what you want to do.
But that's in the thought experiment, the default is reversed. So you think about what you want to do. That is, do I elect to have a child, right? Not what do I have to do to keep from having a child. And it's that reversal that's part of this.
There's a difference between saying, do I want this reversed after 2 years, or do I want another dose after 2 years?
Right.
You're still evaluating.
You have to do something. Yeah.
You have to do a physical minor surgical procedure, though. And
pay another fee, right?
So actually taking the 2 year would be better than taking 2.5, 2 years.
No, the point she's making, if you use this metaphorical combination lock chastity belt, that if you can just instantly undo it and it's otherwise on unless you undo it, is quite different than having to re-up repetitively on a 2-year cycle for a minor surgical invasive procedure. We actually have to go ahead and do a tiny laceration and put a little tiny tube.
Reversing the default, and there are many other technological varieties that we can anticipate.
So you can't get pregnant right away.
No. We're assuming that these are side effect-free, risk-free. When there are plenty of assumes, and that's easily granted in all the technological development. But the question is, your point is so well put, right? Shouldn't we be focusing on the end state and working back to make sure that we...
Those would be failures that have to be addressed. If you're worried about all of these assumptions, they start off as assumptions and then they become solutions. Okay, in order for me to say I won, I succeeded, it has to be instantly reversible, purposely controllable. It restores fertility within one natural cycle, right? All of these things then become requirements for success.
Individually controlled so that the state can...
Exactly. Right. When we start looking at these moral issues of coercion, it has to be something where I can't be coerced. I may never get that one. But all of these objections can only become solutions if I say this is what I want in the first place. I want this outcome, and it has to look like X, Y, Z, A, B, and C. It has to meet all of these things, or we're not done yet.
The problem that
we're not done yet is going to be
Oh yeah. It's been 200-300 years for all of her examples.
I mean, we're going to have to wrap up now, but the point that I was kind of thinking that was being missed here for the whole notion of coercion, social coercion, was it left out the whole notion of coercion by the significant other, by the spouse, which actually is far more leverage than any kind of governmental intrusion. So the real concern is, even if you had this combination lock chastity belt, that you would have someone else saying, you will unlock it now. You will do this now because I tell you to, because of the coercive influence of the significant other.
That won't be a new feature of the world.
No. The point is that's part of the practical part of coercion and evil that can occur in the world. Though.
Yeah. But it's not something we'd add to the world with this thought experiment.
Correct.
Really, again, the thought experiment doesn't actually change that at all.
It doesn't account for how to counter it.
No, it doesn't. That's separate from the experiment entirely. Yeah.
So the bottom line is, we really have to work that there really is a real use for these practical thought experiments in applied philosophy, in bioethics, and it's really important not to let ourselves be nipped in the bud by objections before we get to entertaining the outcome state and working backwards. That's the